My own son called me delusional in open court. He didn't even lower his voice. He said it clearly with the calm assurance of a man reading a weather report. My mother is no longer capable of rational decision-making. And just like that, I became an object, a medical exhibit, an inconvenience disguised as a diagnosis. I remember the room more vividly than his face. The pale walls, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with expensive perfume from the woman sitting behind him. She was his wife, of course, crossing her legs with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed composure. They both looked so certain. That's what stunned me most, not the accusation itself, but the ease with which it came out of his mouth, as though this betrayal had been waiting patiently for the right paperwork to appear. I sat there quietly, my hands folded in my lap, remembering another day, many years earlier, when that same boy had stood trembling in front of me with a fever, and I'd held a cold cloth to his forehead until he fell asleep. That was the last time I'd seen him vulnerable. Now, apparently, I was the fragile one, and he was the responsible adult saving me from myself. The irony could have killed me if irony were lethal. I'm 81 years old. I taught literature for 45 of those years, everything from Shakespeare to Baldwin to the quiet, invisible heartbreak of Dickinson. I live in the same modest house my husband built with his hands back when roofs still leaked and walls had to be patched every winter. After he died, the house shrank, not in size but in sound. You start to notice silence differently when you're alone. It has edges. I filled mine with books, old radio shows, and the occasional visit from Michael, my son, the very same who later tried to have me declared insane. He came on Sundays sometimes, though less and less after his promotion at the bank. He'd sit at my kitchen table, scroll through his phone, tell me about interest rates and property values, never once asking what I was reading. I'd offer him coffee, and he'd take it with the distracted politeness of someone enduring a task. I didn't mind. I thought that was what love became after 50, a series of polite exchanges between two people who had run out of need. I was wrong. Love still burns, but only when someone tries to snuff it out. The first time I realized something had changed was when he suggested I let him help manage things. It was a simple sentence, harmless in tone, the kind adult children say when they want to seem caring. Mom, let me take care of the bills. You shouldn't have to worry about that. I didn't argue. I'd spent decades balancing ledgers, paying off a mortgage, and funding his education without complaint. Why should I object to a little help now? But help, as it turned out, was the polite word for takeover. Within months, I noticed certain letters stopped arriving, bank statements, pension updates. When I asked, he smiled too easily. Everything's digital now. Don't stress about it. I should have known then. The kindest lies always wear efficiency as perfume. He began visiting more often after that, always with his wife, who looked at my house the way realtors look at properties, estimating potential. She'd comment on my wallpaper, the clutter of photographs on the mantel, the outdated stove. Once she even asked if I'd ever considered selling before the neighborhood changes. I told her no. This house was my anchor. She smiled the kind of smile that means, not for long. A few weeks later, I overheard them whispering in the kitchen when they thought I was asleep. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard unsafe, evaluation, and doctor's note. I should have confronted them. Instead, I did what women of my generation were trained to do. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. We were taught that patience would turn poison into water. It never does. The letter came 2 months later, folded in a plain white envelope with the county seal. At first I thought it was a mistake, some bureaucratic error. It used words that sounded almost neutral. Petition for guardianship due to diminished mental capacity. I read it twice before it made sense. They were taking me to court. My son had signed his name neatly at the bottom. I remember the moment I saw it. The way the M in Michael slanted forward, like it was in a hurry to escape the truth. There was no warning, no conversation, just the formal accusation that I was no longer fit to decide the course of my own life. I laughed, actually laughed, when I read it. Then I sat very still for a long time. Laughter has a way of disguising collapse. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not the neighbors, not the ladies from the library, not even my sister on the phone. Shame is strange. It doesn't always come from guilt. Sometimes it comes from disbelief. How do you explain to people that the child you raised with both hands is now trying to put a legal leash around your mind? You don't. You just start counting how many steps it takes to move from the kitchen table to the window because pacing feels like control. I kept rereading that petition until the words blurred. My name appeared 12 times, each one stripped of warmth, reduced to the respondent. I had become a respondent to my own erasure. It's a peculiar thing, the way betrayal ages differently than love. Love fades gently, like an old photograph. Betrayal rots. It grows sharper with every memory. I started remembering small things I'd dismissed over the years. The time he refused to introduce me to his colleagues because I make people uncomfortable with my honesty. The way he once joked at a dinner party that his mother talks to ghosts. Because I'd mentioned dreaming about his father, he'd turn me into a story long before he turned me into a case. The day before the first hearing, I sat at my desk surrounded by the clutter of a life. Graded essays, old lesson plans, the wooden ruler my husband used when he built this very room. I found a photograph of Michael at 15, standing beside me at his school graduation, his arm draped awkwardly over my shoulder. He looked proud then. So did I. I wondered what version of me he remembered when he signed that petition. The mother who stayed up late correcting papers so his tuition would be paid on time. The widow who never complained when money was tight. Or the old woman he now described as unstable because it made the paperwork easier. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror that night, I saw neither madness nor fragility. I saw weariness, the kind that comes from years of explaining your worth to people who only see your usefulness. I ironed my blouse for the hearing, polished my old shoes, and packed a small notebook in my purse. I wasn't planning to fight. Not yet. I just wanted to understand what kind of story my son had built about me and whether anyone in that courtroom would recognize the woman inside it. It's strange, the way one moment can rearrange an entire life. Until that day, I believed sanity was a private matter, something you either possessed or lost. I didn't realize it could be taken from you by consensus. The court document said I might be suffering from early cognitive decline. The phrase sounded polite, almost tender, like a gentle push toward the edge. I suppose that's what modern cruelty looks like. Soft language wrapped around hard intent. So, when people ask where my story begins, I don't say, in the courtroom. It started the moment my son stopped asking how I was and started asking where my checkbook was. The rest was just paperwork catching up to the truth. And though that first day in court will always live somewhere behind my ribs, colder than any winter I've known, I also remember something else. The silence right before the judge spoke. I looked at him, and for a split second, I thought he looked familiar. But that comes later. For now, all you need to know is this. They tried to write me out of my own life, but I was the one who taught them how to write. And that, my dear, is where their first mistake began. The day the petition arrived, I still believed in misunderstanding. I thought if I called the right number, spoke in my calm teacher's voice, explain myself with precision, the error would correct itself, like a student's typo in an essay. I did not yet understand that the machinery had already been set in motion, and that logic has no power against convenience. The letter asked me to attend a preliminary evaluation, a phrase that sounded harmless until I realized it meant psychological testing. My son had apparently written that I was becoming increasingly disoriented, failing to manage finances, and showing signs of paranoia. Those were the exact words. I read them again and again, tasting their weight, recognizing his phrasing from years of polite arguments we'd had about my independence. He had learned to disguise control as care, and I had taught him how to argue convincingly. That irony kept me company through the night. 2 women came to my house the following week. One was a social worker with a clipboard, the other a young psychologist whose smile never reached her eyes. They asked if I knew the date, my address, the name of the president. I answered everything correctly, even added a few historical footnotes out of habit, but they kept nodding with that gentle condescension reserved for the elderly. The younger one asked if I ever felt confused or had difficulty remembering recent events. I told her I forget grocery lists, but can still recite Yeats from memory. She wrote something down anyway. When they left, my house felt smaller, as if their questions had sucked the air from the rooms. I walked into the kitchen and saw that one of them had left a pen on the counter, the cheap plastic kind with the agency logo. I picked it up and threw it into the trash. It felt like reclaiming something, though I wasn't sure what. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from Michael. His tone was patient, professional, distant. He said he hoped the visit had gone well and that this process was only a formality to ensure safety and transparency. He used those words, safety and transparency, as though he were conducting an audit, not dismantling his mother's autonomy. I wanted to call back and ask if he remembered the nights I stayed awake, reading by the light of the kitchen bulb, so he could sleep in a warm house. But that kind of memory is useless in a system that prefers forms to feelings. I didn't call him. Instead, I wrote his words down in my notebook, the one I used for quotes and fragments of poems, because they sounded like something that should be studied for meaning. Ensure safety and transparency. Weeks passed. Strangers came and went, inspectors, nurses, clerks, all performing small rituals of intrusion. They photographed the medications in my bathroom cabinet and made notes about the expired milk in my refrigerator as if sanity could be measured by the freshness of dairy. They asked who helped me cook, whether I used the stove, if I ever forgot to turn it off. I said no, but I could see in their eyes that the answer had already been decided elsewhere. Every question was a doorway leading to guilt. When they left, I cleaned obsessively, scrubbing counters, folding towels, aligning books by height. I wanted the house to look sane, though I began to realize that sanity in their eyes meant erasure. No clutter, no warmth, no proof of living. Then came the call from the court clerk, confirming the hearing date. Her voice was brisk, businesslike, but she hesitated when she read the case title aloud. The matter of Michael Harlow versus Martha Harlow, petition for guardianship. I heard the small tremor in her tone, the almost imperceptible pause between my son's name and mine. Even bureaucrats, I suppose, can recognize when something human has gone wrong. I thanked her politely and hung up. The silence afterward was so deep, I could hear the old clock in the hallway struggling to keep time. That evening, I decided to walk to the grocery store, a habit I'd abandoned since my hips started complaining about distance. The air was damp and cool, the kind that makes you remember your body. I wanted to move, to feel the pavement under my feet, to prove to myself that I was not the fragile figure described in the petition. At the checkout, I saw Mrs. Langley, my neighbor, who had known me for 30 years. When she looked at me, there was something unfamiliar in her eyes, an awkward blend of pity and suspicion. "I heard you've been having a rough time, dear," she said softly, her voice dripping with secondhand concern. I smiled, said I was fine, and paid for my groceries. But as I walked home, I realized how fast rumors travel once they've been stamped with official ink. By the time I reached my porch, I felt like an exhibit in a small-town museum, observed, mislabeled, and quietly pitied. The first formal notice arrived the next morning. It outlined the allegations: mismanagement of funds, erratic behavior, potential endangerment to self. There was even a statement from my son's wife claiming she'd found me wandering aimlessly near the park one afternoon. I remembered that day. I had been feeding the ducks, as I often did after visiting the library. The only aimless thing about me was kindness. I sat down with the document in my lap and laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurdly neat. My life had been translated into administrative language, every emotion flattened into evidence. I went to see the lawyer they appointed for me, a woman barely older than my grandson. Her office smelled of coffee and toner. She greeted me kindly, but kept glancing at her computer, typing notes as I spoke. When I told her my son's accusations were exaggerated, she smiled in that professional way meant to calm clients. "These things happen more often than you'd think," she said. "Families get worried. It's usually resolved quickly." I asked her how often the mothers win. She hesitated just long enough to tell me the truth before she spoke. "It depends," she said, "on what the judge sees." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker, remembering every time I had taught my students about justice, about the fragile balance between truth and interpretation. Now I was about to become a character in that lesson. I took out the old wooden box where I keep letters and keepsakes. Among them was a faded newspaper clipping from decades ago, a feature on my retirement ceremony. In the photo, I was smiling, holding a bouquet of daisies, surrounded by former students. The caption read, "Beloved teacher bids farewell to a lifetime of shaping young minds." I stared at that phrase, shaping young minds, and wondered which of those minds had learned to turn against its maker. 2 nights before the hearing, I received a message from an unknown number. It was brief. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I stared at the screen until it dimmed. I could almost hear his voice, flat, managerial, tired of explaining. That was when I stopped feeling hurt. The grief burned itself out and left something colder, sharper in its place. If they wanted to question my mind, I would show them every corner of it, polished and alive. I started preparing my own notes, the way I used to prepare lectures. I organized dates, receipts, bank statements, lists of books I'd read recently, quotes I could recall by heart. Proofs of coherence, small pieces of evidence that I still existed in order. I even practiced my handwriting, determined that no tremor would betray me. Somewhere between the papers, I found an old essay marked in red ink, written by a student named Daniel Ferris. The topic was moral philosophy. I had written across the top, "Brilliant argument, but remember, principles mean nothing until tested." I smiled at the memory. He had gone on to law school, I'd heard. At the time, I hadn't known he would resurface decades later, at the precise moment when my life would require its own test of principle. When dawn came, The light fell pale and cold across the dining table where I'd spread my documents like offerings. The air smelled faintly of coffee and defiance. I wasn't afraid anymore. Betrayal, once it reveals itself, becomes strangely clarifying. You stop asking why and start preparing how. I folded the petition neatly, placed it beside the letter from the court, and whispered aloud a line from King Lear, my old companion in lessons about filial cruelty. Sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. The words felt less like poetry and more like prophecy. By the time the cab arrived to take me to the courthouse, I had already accepted that whatever happened next would divide my life in two, before the accusation and after. I locked the door, looked once more at the house I had built, and felt something shift inside me, not sadness, not fear, but the first small spark of resolve. They would call it madness. I would call it memory refusing to die. And that, I suppose, is where my real defense began. The house no longer felt like mine after the petition. It looked the same, bookshelves lined with spines bent by decades of use, curtains faded from the western light, the same armchair with the threadbare cushion where I had graded thousands of papers, but the air had changed. Every corner now carried the echo of scrutiny. I caught myself straightening objects that didn't need straightening, as though order itself could defend me. I began leaving the radio on all day, not for music, but for voices, proof of continuity, of rhythm, of time moving forward. Silence had started to resemble accusation. Each hour stretched like a waiting room before a verdict. Even the cat, usually indifferent to my moods, seemed to study me with uneasy curiosity, as if wondering whether the gossip about my decline might be true. Letters continued to arrive from lawyers and doctors. Each one came folded with clinical neatness, printed in the same indifferent font, addressing me not as a person, but as a case. I learned to dread the sound of the mail slot. Inside were words like capacity assessment, guardianship inquiry, financial oversight. Words that drained color from the language I'd loved all my life. One afternoon, I found an envelope with my son's handwriting. For a moment, I felt the foolish rush of maternal hope. Perhaps an apology, perhaps even a moment of clarity. But when I opened it, I found only a typed letter with his signature printed at the bottom, sterile as a receipt. He explained that the process is for your own protection and that he had consulted professionals who believe intervention is necessary. He ended with, "Please cooperate." 3 words, simple enough to break a person's spine if read correctly. I folded the letter once, then twice, and slipped it into the drawer beneath the cutlery, where things that cut are supposed to live. The neighbors had started avoiding me. Mrs. Langley crossed the street when she saw me watering the garden. Her husband pretended not to notice when my trash bins tipped over during a windstorm. Even the postman, once chatty and warm, now delivered mail with a tight smile, eager to retreat. People prefer their madnesses tidy and distant. The social worker returned once a week to check in, a phrase that sounded more like check up on. She asked if I had been eating properly, if I remembered to pay utilities, if I ever felt disoriented. Her gaze wandered constantly around the room, landing on the smallest imperfections, a stack of unopened books on the floor, a misplaced mug, a half-withered plant. Each object became a potential symptom. I answered politely, resisting the urge to throw her out. There is a particular kind of dignity in measured fury. It leaves fewer fingerprints. When she left, I stood in the doorway watching her drive away, and for the first time, I understood what people mean when they say they feel invisible. It wasn't that I had vanished, but that I had become transparent, a ghost who could still touch objects but not be believed about their texture. That night, I sat at my desk and began writing small notes to myself on scraps of paper. What I cooked for dinner, the time I took my medication, the television program I watched, the headlines from the newspaper. Each detail was a defense, each note a fragment of sanity pinned to the day like a flag. I stored them in a glass jar, labeling it proof. Sleep became irregular. Sometimes I would wake in the dark hours before dawn, certain that someone had been in the house. The floorboards creaked in old familiar ways, but paranoia reshapes sound. Every creak becomes intent. Once, I found the living room lamp unplugged and stood staring at it for several minutes, trying to remember whether I had done it myself. That moment frightened me more than anything, the small pause of doubt. It wasn't evidence of madness. It was evidence of exhaustion, but I knew how easily it could be rewritten. Fatigue can be made to sound like confusion, and confusion like decline. I plugged the lamp back in, turned on every light in the house, and sat awake until morning with a notebook open, listing the titles of every book I could remember teaching. When I reached 57, I stopped, not because I was out of titles, but because the list itself had become ridiculous. I began noticing how people looked through me. At the pharmacy, the cashier spoke slowly, her tone bright and deliberate, the way one speaks to children or foreigners. "Do you need help reading the dosage, ma'am?" she asked. I wanted to tell her that I had once written entire lectures on the power of language, that I could still quote lines about mortality more eloquently than she could ring up a bottle of aspirin, but instead I smiled and said no. Resistance, I was learning, required stealth. Outrage was too easily cataloged as instability. To survive, I had to perform composure like an art form. One afternoon, I visited the bank to withdraw a small amount of cash, and the teller hesitated after typing my name. She said there was a note on the account requiring verification by the cosigner. I told her there was no cosigner, that it was my pension account, established long before my son's birth. She looked embarrassed, disappeared into a back office, and returned with a manager who spoke gently, almost soothingly, about temporary oversight and standard procedure. I realized then that the legal machinery had already reached my money. I felt something cold settle inside me, not fear, but clarity. The cage was being built, quietly, politely, with all the proper signatures. That evening, I decided to reclaim at least one small corner of freedom. I cooked a meal I hadn't made in years, lamb stew with rosemary and red wine. The aroma filled the house, warm and defiant. I set the table for one, lit a candle, and poured myself a glass of the same wine. Eating alone had never felt like victory before, but that night it did. I imagined my son explaining to his lawyer how his supposedly delusional mother was sautéing onions and timing her simmering with precision. Insanity rarely smells so domestic. After dinner, I wrote a letter, not to him, but to myself, detailing the day's events and ending with a line I once gave my students: "When the world doubts your voice, record it yourself." The following week, I received notice of a court-appointed medical examination. It would take place at a clinic across town. The letter included a list of tests: cognitive, behavioral, psychiatric. I recognized the structure. I had graded essays with fewer requirements. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a dark skirt, a pressed blouse, and my husband's old watch. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and paper. The doctor, a man half my age with tired eyes, asked me to draw a clock on a sheet of paper. I did so perfectly, but he still made a note. Then he asked me to remember 3 words: apple, table, penny. I repeated them easily. 10 minutes later, he asked for them again. I told him not only the words, but their etymology. He smiled politely, unimpressed. When I left, he shook my hand and said, "We'll be in touch." I walked home through the drizzle, feeling both proud and humiliated. There's nothing quite like being forced to prove your existence with fruit and furniture. By then, my world had narrowed to the walls of my house and the paperwork that seemed to breed overnight. The social worker called to remind me of the upcoming court date and asked if I needed assistance with transportation. I said no. I still remembered how to cross a street. She laughed lightly, not catching the bitterness. After she hung up, I stood by the window watching the leaves fall. The garden I had planted years ago with my husband was thinning, but the roses still bloomed defiantly. I decided to cut a few and place them in a vase on the table for the hearing day, a small reminder of something ungoverned. The night before the trial, I went through the jar labeled proof. I read each note. April 2nd, paid gas bill online. April 5th, read Faulkner, still understand irony. April 7th, forgot to buy milk, remembered before the store closed. The collection was absurd and sacred. Each slip of paper carried the weight of defiance disguised as routine. I poured them back into the jar and sealed it tightly. The house was quiet, except for the steady ticking of the clock that had belonged to my mother. I touched the glass, whispering, "Still on time." Before bed, I allowed myself a single moment of weakness. I took out the family photograph from the living room shelf, the one from Michael's graduation. His young face glowed with ambition, mine with pride. I wondered when that pride had turned to threat in his eyes. Maybe when I refused to sell the house. Maybe when he realized I would never be a silent parent whose assets could be quietly redistributed. Betrayal rarely begins in one moment. It grows like ivy around opportunity. I placed the photograph back, face down this time, not in anger, but to give it rest. I slept little, but in the final hour before dawn, a peculiar calm arrived. I realized that madness and freedom sometimes look alike to those who crave control. If that was the language my son wanted to speak, I would learn its grammar and turn it against him. The thought made me almost smile. As the first light crept across the ceiling, I dressed again, reheating yesterday's coffee, steadying my breath. Outside, the street was empty, the world unaware that a small rebellion was about to unfold quietly, politely, in the body of an old woman no one believes still capable of one. The morning of the hearing dawned too bright for November, a thin sunlight that made the city look brittle, like glass about to crack. I arrived early, out of habit more than anxiety, clutching a small leather folder with my notes, receipts, and the jar labeled proof, though I left the jar in my bag. The courthouse smelled like paper and nerves, a scent I recognized from faculty meetings, except those had ended in coffee breaks rather than verdicts. I sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, watching lawyers move briskly past with their briefcases and hollow confidence. They all looked the same to me, people who mistook procedure for truth. When I finally heard my name, it sounded unfamiliar, as though they were summoning a character from a story I hadn't agreed to be in. Inside, the room was small, clinical, with no trace of grandeur. My son sat across the aisle, his shoulders straight, his tie knotted tightly. He didn't look at me at first, but when he did, I saw something fleeting, perhaps guilt, perhaps exhaustion. The woman beside him, his wife, avoided my gaze altogether, staring instead at the stack of documents in front of her like a stage prop. Their lawyer, a man with perfectly combed silver hair, greeted the judge with practiced warmth. I remained seated, hands folded, my expression neutral. The judge entered, and everyone rose. When I saw his face, recognition arrived not as shock, but as a soft, delayed breath. His nameplate read, Honor Daniel Ferris. Of course it did. Memory has a cruel sense of timing. I remembered him instantly, though decades had passed. He'd been one of my quiet students, the kind who sat near the window, who rarely spoke but listened fiercely. I remembered the way he used to tilt his head when a line of poetry caught him off guard, the seriousness in his eyes that made me think he might someday understand justice not as a profession, but as a discipline of the heart. And now here he was, robed in authority, his expression composed, perhaps not yet aware of the symmetry life had arranged between us. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but laughter, in court, counts as instability. The proceedings began. My son's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth, confident, dripping with the kind of reason that sounds charitable until you examine it. He described me as a once capable woman, now exhibiting confusion and erratic judgment. He mentioned patterns of forgetfulness, unpaid bills, neglected home maintenance. He said I was resistant to assistance, as if autonomy were a symptom. I listened, feeling as though someone were describing a stranger with my face. The phrases had been crafted to sound benevolent, language that implied concern while erasing respect. My son kept his eyes on the table. Occasionally, he nodded, as though agreeing with a diagnosis of weather. When the lawyer finished, he gestured toward me. "We seek only to ensure her safety, Your Honor." The judge turned his gaze to me. His eyes were calm, gray, unreadable. For a moment, I thought he didn't recognize me, and then I saw the smallest flicker, something like hesitation. He cleared his throat and asked if I wished to speak. My lawyer, young and nervous, whispered that it might be better to wait. I ignored her. I had waited long enough. I stood slowly, aware that every movement was being watched. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor," I began, "I have been called many things in my life, teacher, wife, mother, but never unfit until today." My voice didn't shake, though I expected it might. "My son believes I've lost the ability to manage my affairs. I disagree. I may forget where I left my keys, but I remember every sacrifice that built his future. I remember the mortgage payments made on time for 30 years. I remember the night I sold my wedding ring to help him with tuition. I remember the hours spent at his bedside when pneumonia threatened to take him before he even had the chance to disappoint me." I paused, watching the lawyer's pen still against his pad. "If memory is the measure of sanity, then I am still more whole than most." A faint murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced. I saw the judge's face tighten slightly, not disapproval, but something else, maybe the recognition of tone. I continued, "They say I have become forgetful, that I live alone, that I am unsafe. I live alone because my husband is dead, and my son prefers convenience to company. I am unsafe only in the presence of betrayal. As for forgetfulness, yes, I forget things, names of new medications, the location of a pair of glasses, but never the meaning of words. I still know what greed looks like when it wears the costume of duty." My lawyer tugged discreetly at my sleeve, but I went on. "I taught literature for 45 years, Your Honor. I spent my life explaining to young people that language is power. And I can tell you that in every age, the first thing tyrants do is rename cruelty as care." I looked directly at my son. His face had gone pale. He whispered something to his lawyer, who shook his head. The judge asked if I had any evidence to support my statement. I opened my folder, hands steady, and took out a stack of papers, receipts, letters, notes, proof that I am capable of managing my own life. I laid them out one by one. This is a record of bills paid. Here, a letter from my bank confirming no outstanding debts. Here, a list of books I've read this year, with annotations. You may find the handwriting small, but the thoughts remain large. A small ripple of laughter broke somewhere behind me. Even the judge's mouth twitched. I added softly, "Old habits die hard. Teachers like evidence." Then something shifted. The judge leaned forward slightly and asked, almost casually, "Mrs. Harlow, did you once teach at Eastwood High?" I nodded. "Yes," I said, "for many years." He glanced down, then back at me. "I thought so," he murmured, barely audible. "You taught me to read beyond the lines." The courtroom seemed to pause. My son's lawyer looked puzzled, my own lawyer startled. I felt the air loosen in my chest. "And did you?" I asked quietly. He met my gaze. "I'm trying." From that moment, the tone changed. The rest of the hearing unfolded with less arrogance. The lawyer's arguments began to sound rehearsed, mechanical, and my responses, measured but firm, seemed to linger longer in the judge's mind. He asked his own questions, how I spent my days, what plans I had for the future, whether I had support. I told him about my garden, my reading group, the small online tutoring I still did for neighborhood students. I described the rhythm of my days with the detail of someone fully inhabiting them. When he asked how I managed my finances, I answered plainly, "I have 2 accounts, one for living expenses, one for savings, both maintained with precision." The lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her finish," he said. It was a small mercy, but it carried the weight of vindication. As the session drew to a close, I felt exhaustion creep into my bones, but beneath it, a strange kind of relief. For the first time in months, I had spoken without being translated. My words had been mine, not filtered through reports or polite distortions. I looked at my son. He avoided my gaze again, his jaw tight. I knew what he was thinking, that I had embarrassed him, that this display would make him look foolish. But I also saw a flicker of something else, something dangerously close to shame. When the judge called a recess, I remained seated while everyone else stood. My lawyer whispered that I had done well. I nodded, though it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something quieter, recognition perhaps, or the faint stirring of dignity that had been dormant too long. As people filed out, I glanced toward the bench. The judge was speaking with the clerk, but when he looked up, our eyes met once more. He gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. It told me he had seen the person, not the case. Outside, the hallway smelled faintly of rain and old stone. I found a bench near the window and sat down, watching the light change across the tiled floor. My lawyer excused herself to make calls. I reached into my bag, pulled out the jar of notes, and held it between my palms. Inside were fragments of my days, ink and paper, proof of ordinary sanity. I realized I no longer needed to show them to anyone. They had served their purpose. They had kept me company through the season of disbelief. I placed the jar back, closed the clasp, and exhaled. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something close to calm. The machinery of accusation was still turning, but its rhythm no longer terrified me. I had remembered who I was, a woman who built her life on the weight of words, who taught a boy to read for meaning and had, without knowing it, equipped him to one day see her truth. I would not call it fate. Fate is lazy. It was memory, returning like a long-forgotten student, raising his hand at last. The days after the hearing passed in a strange quiet that was neither peace nor exhaustion, but something in between. A suspended stillness, like the hush before a storm that has already chosen where it will break. I told myself that the worst was over, that my son's accusations had been blunted by the truth of my own steadiness, that the judge's measured eyes had seen what they needed to see. For a few mornings, I even believed it. I resumed my old habits, making tea at dawn, opening the curtains to the hesitant light, tending to the roses that clung stubbornly to life despite the cold. I read in the afternoons and wrote in my notebook each night, not the defensive notes of before, but reflections on what had been said, how words can wound differently when they come from those you once nourished. Yet the silence of the telephone, the absence of letters, the sense of being watched through the polite machinery of bureaucracy, all began to coil around me again, slowly, deliberately. A week after the hearing, an envelope arrived bearing the seal of the court. For a moment my pulse quickened with dread, but inside was not a verdict, only a notice. Continuation of evaluation, pending submission of additional evidence. It was a sentence with the personality of a stone. I took it as a reminder that my life was still a file waiting for its last page. I placed the notice on the mantel beneath my husband's photograph and decided that, whatever further evidence they required, it would come from my own hand. I had spent my career teaching students to support their claims. Now I would support my existence. The second wave began quietly. Michael started calling again, not with apologies, but with a new tone, smooth, managerial, suffused with reason. "Mom," he said, "let's not make this adversarial. Everyone just wants to make sure you're comfortable." He said, "everyone," the way one speaks of a board committee. I listened, allowing him to fill the silence with his explanations about safety, community resources, financial prudence. Then he mentioned something that made my stomach tighten. "There's an assisted living facility near me. It's private, very reputable. They handle everything, meals, laundry, medical visits. You'd love it." He spoke as if he were describing a resort. I asked quietly whether this was his idea or his lawyer's. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "You shouldn't be alone out there. The world's not kind to people your age." I told him the world had never been particularly kind, but that I had managed well enough without handlers. He sighed, the long exhale of a man who mistakes control for concern. "Just think about it," he said. "It would simplify things for both of us." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through each room of the house, touching objects as though they were talismans. The armchair where my husband used to read the newspaper, the small clock that had ticked through every argument and reconciliation of our marriage, the worn handles of the kitchen drawers I had opened 1,000 times. These were not possessions. They were coordinates of self. The thought of being removed from them, of being placed in a neutral room where every wall was painted the same beige of benevolent confinement, made my throat tighten. People imagine madness as the loss of reason, but sometimes it is simply the loss of context. Take away a person's surroundings, their rituals, their history, and even the sane will begin to fray. The following morning, I received a visit from a woman I didn't know, a representative from the facility my son had mentioned. She arrived unannounced, holding a clipboard and wearing a navy blazer that seemed designed to resist empathy. "I just wanted to introduce myself," she said with a rehearsed smile. "Your son speaks very highly of you. We'd love to welcome you to our community." I told her I hadn't decided to move anywhere. She nodded, undeterred, and began describing the amenities: on-site medical staff, daily social activities, memory workshops, secured access for safety. I let her speak, watching her mouth form the phrases of institutional kindness. When she finally paused, I asked how many residents had voluntarily come there without family pressure. She blinked, her smile faltering for the first time. "It's always a family decision," she said. I told her families make excellent prisons. She made a note on her clipboard and left soon after. That evening, I found the courage to call the courthouse directly. The clerk who answered remembered my case and explained, with bureaucratic politeness, that the petition was still technically open until the judge issued a formal dismissal. "Sometimes these things take time," she said. I asked if I could submit a written statement clarifying my position. "You can," she replied, "but it's not necessary unless new claims are filed." New claims. The phrase stuck with me like a splinter. A few days later they arrived. My lawyer forwarded me a document filed by my son's counsel alleging continued cognitive instability and episodes of erratic communication. Attached were 2 witness statements, one from a neighbor who claimed I'd left my lights on all night, and another from the representative of the facility who described our conversation as hostile. I had used a single sentence of truth, and it had been transformed into aggression. Reading those pages, I felt the familiar nausea of déjà vu, the way women are disciplined not for what they say, but for the tone in which they say it. I decided to take the train to the city to meet my lawyer in person. She looked exhausted, though she tried to sound confident. "This is typical," she said, "especially in family cases involving assets." She tapped the papers with her pen. "Your son's lawyer is testing whether the judge will reconsider." She paused, then added, "It might help if you appeared cooperative. Agree to a home assessment, maybe even a temporary guardian just for finances. It would make you look reasonable." I stared at her for a long moment. "Reasonable," I repeated, tasting the word. "They tried to take my sanity, my independence, and now you want me to surrender pieces of both to appear reasonable?" She looked away. "It's strategy," she murmured. I gathered my papers, stood up, and said, "I've spent my life teaching young people that strategy without integrity is just cowardice in a suit." I left before she could respond. The ride home was long, the train windows reflecting the gray afternoon and my own face in it. Older, yes, but not broken. I thought about the judge, about the brief glint of recognition in his eyes, and wondered whether he knew what had been filed since the hearing. I thought about writing to him directly, but something in me resisted the idea of appealing to anyone's pity. Dignity, once lost, cannot be begged back. It must be rebuilt, brick by deliberate brick. In the days that followed, the surveillance tightened. The social worker began calling twice a week just to check in. A nurse I had never met showed up with a clipboard, saying she was conducting a wellness visit at the family's request. I let her in, offered tea, answered her questions in full sentences. When she asked if I ever felt lonely, I said yes, but only when surrounded by people who pretend to care. She wrote something down quickly and changed the subject. After she left, I realized that resistance had become my form of sanity. Every polite defiance, every well-placed sentence was a small reclamation of ground. Then came the phone call that shifted everything. The courthouse clerk rang one afternoon to inform me of a follow-up review scheduled in 2 weeks. She said the judge wanted to hear both parties again before issuing the final decision. My first reaction was fatigue, another performance of sanity before an audience of suspicion. But beneath it, a current of resolve stirred. I remembered the look in Judge Ferris's eyes, the line he had spoken. "You taught me to read beyond the lines." Perhaps it was time to remind him what that truly meant. For the next days I prepared. I reread my old notebooks, selected passages from literature that spoke of autonomy and truth. I copied them out in careful longhand, not to quote, but to steady myself. From Virginia Woolf. Lock up your libraries if you like, but there is no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of my mind. From Baldwin. The place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it. I wrote those words on index cards and placed them around the house, on the refrigerator, above the sink, near the bedside lamp, so that each room reminded me who I was. I ironed my best dress, polished my shoes, and placed my husband's watch on the dresser. The night before the hearing, I cleaned the kitchen until the counters gleamed. There is a dignity in preparation that no accusation can erase. The morning of the review was wet and gray. I took a cab to the courthouse, the same driver who had driven me weeks before. He remembered me and said, "Back again, huh?" I smiled faintly. It seems I'm becoming a regular feature. He chuckled, unaware of the truth inside the joke. When I entered the courtroom, it was emptier this time, quieter, as though even the walls were tired of repetition. My son was there, his expression unreadable, his lawyer beside him with the same glint of practiced superiority. The judge entered and nodded briefly toward me. The hearing began. The lawyer started with new arguments couched in the language of concern. He cited patterns of resistance, emotional volatility, refusal to comply with wellness evaluations. He mentioned the visit from the facility representative, twisting my words into evidence of paranoia. As he spoke, I felt the heat rise in my chest, not anger exactly, but the recognition of how truth becomes a casualty in the hands of those who believe themselves benevolent. When it was my turn, I stood, slowly, deliberately. "Your Honor," I said, "I understand the need for caution. Old age can look fragile from a distance, but fragility is not the same as incompetence. I resist intrusion, not because I am unstable, but because I have earned my solitude. I have spent a lifetime giving away pieces of myself to students, to institutions, to family, and what remains is mine by right of endurance. If that appears unreasonable, then perhaps reason has grown too small." The judge listened without interruption. My son fidgeted, eyes darting between me and the bench. I went on. "They say I am unwell because I refuse assistance. But tell me, who benefits from that assistance? Who gains when I relinquish control of my home, my savings, my decisions? It is not safety they seek. It is convenience. I am not ill. I am inconvenient." A faint murmur moved through the room. I let the silence stretch before I continued. "If I were truly losing my mind, I would not be standing here quoting the very text that shaped yours, Your Honor. I would be silent. And silence, in cases like mine, is the easiest evidence to obtain. But I am not silent. I am speaking, and that is my defense." When I finished, the judge closed his file slowly. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Mrs. Harlow," he said quietly, "you remind me that the law is not always the measure of wisdom." His words were careful, but the meaning was clear. He announced that he would issue his decision within the week and that all further evaluations were suspended. My son opened his mouth as if to protest, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm. The hearing ended there, in a hush so complete that the sound of the gavel felt almost merciful. Outside, the air smelled of rain and metal. I walked down the courthouse steps slowly, one hand on the railing, the other holding my bag close. I didn't feel triumphant. Triumph belongs to battles fought in public. What I felt was restoration, the slow return of something that had been taken without consent. The sky above was a dull silver, But the air was clean, and for the first time in months, I inhaled without hesitation. My mind was still my own, and the world, though smaller now, was once again visible through my own eyes. The letter from the court arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped quietly through the mail slot between two grocery flyers as if it were nothing more than another advertisement. I found it lying face down on the doormat, its pale envelope damp from the mist that hung in the air. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, reluctant to touch it, because that small, thin object contained the power to define what remained of my life. I made myself a cup of tea first, the same way I had done every morning since this began, because ritual is what keeps fear from gaining too much authority. I sat at the kitchen table, the cup warming my hands, and only when the steam began to fade did I open the envelope. There were no unnecessary words inside, no elaborate phrasing, just a few formal sentences confirming the dismissal of the petition and the restoration of my full legal capacity. It was over, at least on paper. The court found insufficient evidence to justify the claim of incapacity. I read the sentence twice, 3 times, letting each syllable press against the months of humiliation that had preceded it. The weight did not lift at once. It shifted slowly, uncertainly, as though my body didn't yet trust that it was free. I sat for a long time, the letter open in front of me, and listened to the small sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the groan of the refrigerator, the wind teasing the window latch. They sounded ordinary again. I hadn't realized how much I had missed ordinary sounds. I felt the ghost of a smile somewhere between relief and disbelief. But the silence after victory is different from peace. It is cautious, like a room after an argument, where the furniture remembers everything. I knew that Michael would call. He was too proud not to, too desperate to frame defeat as misunderstanding. And I also knew that I would have to speak to him, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because unfinished things rot faster than wounds. The call came in the evening. The sky had already turned that dim blue that looks like the color of resignation. His number flashed on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out, but avoidance is its own form of surrender. I answered on the 4th ring. His voice was careful, stripped of the arrogance it once carried. "Mom," he said, "I saw the decision." I said nothing. He hesitated. "I hope you know I only wanted what was best for you." I almost laughed, but my laughter these days felt more like an old scar being touched. "You wanted what was best for you," I said finally. "You just confused the two." There was a long silence on his end, the kind that used to fill our kitchen when he was a teenager caught in a lie. Then he said, "I'm sorry you took it that way." It was the kind of apology that isn't one at all. I told him that the judge's decision had nothing to do with my perception and everything to do with the truth, which he had tried to rewrite in legal language. He said something about moving forward, about how this ordeal had been stressful for everyone, about family needing to stay connected. I let him speak until his sentences began to loop back on themselves. Then I interrupted. "Michael," I said softly, "you tried to erase me. I won't pretend that was love." He started to protest, but I hung up. There are moments when hanging up is the most articulate thing a person can do. After that, I stood for a long time by the window, the phone still in my hand, looking at the faint reflection of my face in the glass. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph requires an audience, and mine was only the evening air. What I felt was older, deeper, a quiet certainty that I had survived something that was meant to unmake me. The paper on the table behind me, with its clean, bureaucratic phrasing, was a certificate of sanity issued by the same system that had doubted it, and that irony made me smile for real this time. Freedom, I realized, is rarely granted by verdict. It is reclaimed in the moment you stop seeking permission for it. The following day, I dressed carefully and went back to the courthouse, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to stand in that room one last time and see it empty. The security guard recognized me and nodded politely. "All settled, ma'am?" he asked. "For now," I said, and he smiled as if he understood. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered. Without the bodies of spectators and lawyers, it looked almost fragile, stripped of its authority. I stood near the bench, imagining again the way Judge Ferris had looked at me during the hearing, the small crease between his eyebrows when I spoke, the way he had paused before his ruling as if weighing something heavier than procedure. I didn't expect to see him, but as I turned to leave, the side door opened, and there he was, without his robe this time, carrying a stack of folders. He looked surprised for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, "I didn't expect you." "I came to thank you," I replied, not for the verdict, but for listening. He nodded, setting the folders on a nearby table. "You didn't make it easy," he said, and there was humor in his voice. "Teachers rarely do," I answered. He hesitated, then said quietly, "You were right about language. The law uses it to cage people. You used it to free yourself." His words landed softly, like a benediction. "You taught me something again," he added. I looked at him for a long moment, and you reminded me that not all of my lessons were wasted. We shook hands, and in that brief gesture, I felt the closing of a circle that had begun decades ago, in a classroom where I was still capable of believing that words could change the course of a life. Perhaps they still could. When I stepped outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. The air smelled of wet pavement and distant rain. I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the city moving around me with its usual indifference, and yet everything looked sharper, more defined. I realized that I had spent so long defending my sanity that I had forgotten what it felt like simply to inhabit it. Each step felt deliberate, a quiet reclamation of gravity. At the corner, I bought myself a coffee from a vendor who didn't know my story, didn't see me as a case, just an old woman ordering her drink. The anonymity was exquisite. I sat on a bench near the square, sipped the coffee, and watched people pass, students, office workers, parents pulling children by the hand. Life went on, absurdly normal, and I found comfort in that. That evening, I returned home to a quiet house that no longer felt like a battleground. I opened the windows to let in the cool air and placed the court's letter in a frame beside my husband's photograph. It wasn't vanity, it was evidence, the kind that requires no further testimony. I thought of burning it, of letting the ashes scatter over the garden, but decided against it. There was something sacred in the tangible proof of survival. Later, I sat down at my desk and began to write. Not a letter to anyone, not even a diary entry, but a kind of testament, words meant only for myself. I wrote about what had been taken and what had been returned, about how easily a system can turn love into litigation, and about the particular strength it takes to remain human when others insist on turning you into an argument. When the words finally stopped coming, I felt a calm I hadn't known in months. I left the notebook open, the ink still wet, and went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of wine and stood by the sink, watching the slow movement of dusk through the window. The roses in the garden were fading, their petals scattered across the soil like a quiet confession. I thought of Michael again, but not with anger this time. Pity, perhaps, or the distant affection one feels for someone who has lost his way. He would have to live with what he had done, and that, I realized, was punishment enough. Some truths do not need to be enforced. They just need to be witnessed. Later, as the light dimmed, I took out the old photograph from his graduation, the one I had turned face down months before, and placed it upright again on the mantel. I studied his younger face, the bright, uncertain smile of a boy who once trusted me completely. I whispered, "You can't undo what you've done, but I hope one day you'll understand it." The house absorbed my words the way it always had, without judgment, without reply. I left the photograph there, a small gesture of release. Before going to bed, I walked through each room one more time, not to check locks or switches, but to reintroduce myself to my own space. The objects that had been witnesses to my fear now felt returned to me. On my desk lay the letter from the court, the notebook with its open page, the small jar still labeled proof. I unscrewed its lid and scattered the slips of paper into the wastebasket. I no longer needed evidence. Sanity, after all, is not a test one keeps passing, but a rhythm one learns to trust again. When I finally lay down, sleep came easily, like a guest who no longer needed to be convinced of welcome. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, its whistle fading into the dark. I thought of the judge's words, of my son's faltering voice, of the steady pulse of my own mind refusing to be silenced. The world outside could keep its definitions. I had reclaimed my own. And as the night deepened around me, I felt at last something close to peace. Not the fragile peace of escape, but the solid, wordless kind that comes when you have defended your name and won it back without shouting. The winter after the case ended came early that year, sweeping in with a blunt gray wind that rattled the windows and carried the smell of wood smoke from neighboring chimneys. I remember waking one morning to see the garden veiled in frost, each branch encased in a fragile skin of ice that caught the pale light like glass. The world looked briefly perfect, and in that stillness I realized how much of life's noise I had survived. There were no more letters from lawyers, no more phone calls from strangers pretending to care, no more footsteps on the porch that carried the echo of suspicion. The silence was my own again, and it no longer frightened me. I began to understand that victory rarely announces itself with applause. Sometimes it arrives in the shape of an ordinary day, unremarkable and steady, when nothing threatens to take your name away. I settled back into the rhythm of solitude. The house, once a witness to my fear, seemed to exhale around me, its old wood softening as if relieved that the siege was over. I cleaned the study, opening boxes that had sat untouched since my teaching days, finding letters from students who had written to thank me, notes filled with gratitude and longing for the certainty of youth. I reread them slowly, their words stitched with the earnestness of people still believing that language could save them. One of them was from Daniel, written decades earlier, thanking me for teaching him that ethics begins where comfort ends. I smiled at the irony and pinned that letter to the corkboard above my desk. It felt like a quiet benediction from the past, proof that something I had once given had circled back to protect me. Michael did not call again. Weeks passed, then months. Sometimes, when I saw his number flash on the screen, I let it fade without answering. I no longer needed to hear the hollow justifications that wore the mask of remorse. But one afternoon, just before Christmas, he came to the door unannounced. I opened it to find him standing there with his hands deep in his coat pockets, his face pale, older somehow, not from time, but from the exhaustion of pretending to be right. We stood for a long moment, the silence between us too heavy for greeting. He said he had been nearby and thought to check on me. I told him I was fine, better than fine, in fact, and he nodded as if he didn't quite believe it. He looked around the room, at the shelves of books, the framed verdict, the roses drying in a vase. "You really won," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I told him, "I simply refuse to lose." His eyes flickered, a small tremor of shame that he tried to hide. He spoke about his children, about work, about the weather, safe topics for unsafe hearts. When he left, he lingered by the doorway, as if wanting to say something he couldn't find the words for. I didn't help him. Some lessons must be learned in silence. After he was gone, I sat down by the window and watched the snow begin to fall, the sky softening into white. I felt no bitterness, only the slow understanding that forgiveness is not a door you open for the other person, but a window you crack for yourself to let the air move again. I had forgiven him in my own way, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to let resentment become another cage. I thought of all the women I had known, students and friends, who had been silenced by smaller betrayals, who had learned to apologize for their clarity, who had mistaken endurance for peace. I wanted to write to them all, to tell them that survival is not a quiet virtue, but a declaration, that there is dignity in saying no, even when the world insists that no means madness. I began writing again in earnest, not letters or complaints, but reflections, small essays about age, autonomy, and the delicate architecture of sanity. I sent one to a local newspaper under a pseudonym, and they published it, titling it "The Quiet Revolution of an Old Woman." I laughed when I saw it in print. The phrase was both too grand and too true. People began sending letters in response, women mostly, some widowed, some estranged, many describing how easily their own children had begun treating them like fragile ornaments rather than living minds. Their stories were different but carried the same pulse, the fear of vanishing before death. I wrote back to each one, sometimes with advice, sometimes just with acknowledgement. I realized that what had happened to me was not an isolated cruelty, but part of a quieter epidemic, the systematic unseeing of the elderly, especially women who had outlived their usefulness to others' narratives. The months went by gently. I taught a few private lessons again, helping a neighbor's granddaughter with literature. She was 16, impatient and clever, full of the restless certainty of youth. One afternoon, as we were discussing a passage from King Lear, she frowned and asked, "Why does the daughter who tells the truth always get punished first?" I looked at her, and for a moment I saw myself at her age, unafraid to speak, yet unaware of the cost, because truth sounds cruel to those who built their comfort on lies, I said. She wrote it down as if it were an answer for an exam, but I knew it would live in her longer than that. Teaching again felt like re-entering the current of life after drifting too long in still water. Spring came late but kindly. The garden revived itself without my help, as though it had been waiting for permission. I spent afternoons pruning, my hands deep in soil, the earth cool and forgiving beneath my fingers. Sometimes, when I paused to rest, I would glance toward the street and imagine Michael walking by, unable to decide whether to wave. In another life, perhaps we would have shared this quiet, but that version of us had dissolved somewhere between affection and fear. Now I simply wished him the kind of peace that doesn't depend on control. One evening in April, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a short note in a handwriting I recognized immediately. "For what it's worth, I still keep your comments from my essays. You once wrote that conscience is the truest form of intelligence. Thank you for reminding me." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I folded the note carefully and placed it beside Daniel's old letter on the corkboard. It seemed right that both should rest there together, the past student and the present judge, the boy and the man, both having carried something of me into their own reckonings with justice. As the days lengthened, I began to wake before dawn again, not from anxiety, but from habit, drawn to the stillness of early light. I would stand by the window, watching the street slowly take shape, the air full of the fragile sounds of beginning. It occurred to me that what I had regained was not just legal autonomy, but time, the right to fill it with whatever silence or speech I chose. Some mornings I wrote, others I did nothing at all, content just to exist unmeasured. The clock ticked without judgment, and the house, patient as always, held its breath in rhythm with mine. And now, when people ask how I endured it, I tell them this: sanity is not something granted by others. It is the quiet decision to stay whole when the world names you broken. I keep the framed letter on my wall, not as proof of victory, but as a reminder that I once stood at the edge of erasure and stepped back into myself. Some nights, when the wind moves through the house, I think I hear my husband's voice, not as a ghost, but as memory saying, "You made it." I smile and whisper back, "Yes, but it wasn't madness that nearly destroyed me. It was love that forgot its shape." And that, I think, is the truest lesson left to teach, that no one can define your mind for you, and that even when your own children turn you into a question, you are still the answer. The rest is silence, the good kind, the kind that belongs to those who have nothing left to prove.